Yeah?
Good morning. My name is Frank Sinatra.
What? Oh.
He had that magic, that old black magic.
Frank Sinatra is a major success story. You know, a guy comes from immigrants and suddenly becomes one of the biggest stars, or if not the biggest singing star in the world at one time.
He just represented the perfect American.
And he was so damn good because he was revealing his authentic self.
He had this quotidian appeal. Everyone could identify with him.
That great artist, they can sing a song and it can mean a different thing to everybody. That's really great artists.
It's really true that for so many Americans and actually around the world, Sinatra supplied the soundtrack of our lives.
This man had 130 top 40 hits.
Well over 1,000 songs that he recorded.
When you really connect to the song and to the audience, there's something, it's almost like a group hypnosis.
He can take a lyric and make you think he's absolutely feeling it.
He has to be, I guess, the greatest popular singer of the 20th century.
Sinatra was the first rock star.
He was an icon.
At the end of the day, with all of the international popularity and everything else, Frank was a regular guy.
Black magic.
I was trouble right from the beginning. I was born in 1915 on December 12th on they told me, a very wintry, terrible day. And when I was born, there was a problem. I didn't want to come out of there. And they sent up a flare for a doctor. And upon removing me, I was pretty well damaged at my left side of my neck and ear and face. He set me aside in order to save my mother's life. And my grandmother, who had more sense than anybody in the room, as far as I'm concerned, because she knew what to do with me. And she stuck me under the ice-cold water and whacked me around a little bit. And apparently got some blood moving around. Anyway, I grew. Not large, but I grew. Was brought up in a marvelous family, just one child. My mother couldn't have any more babies after that. My dad was a professional boxer, and he aided in bootlegging with one of the tough guys in those days. I don't remember who it was. I was too little to know. But his job was to follow the trucks with the booze so that they weren't hijacked. And I remember in the middle of the night, I heard sobs, terrible crying, and wailing, and all kind of scene went on. And I think my old man was a little slow, and he got hit on the head, and somebody opened up his head, and he came home, and he was bleeding all over the kitchen floor. My mother was hysterical. And then I knew that I was in the right family. After that, of course, he got out of that kind of business, and he opened a saloon, which was a little more gentle than following a bootleg truck.
When he would leave school and go to his father's bar, Marty O'Brien's, they had a player piano. And people knew that Frank could sing because he was in Glee Club and all that stuff as a kid. So they would ask him to sing. And he would go by the piano, sit on the piano with a megaphone. But the guys were just having laughs. And as Frank is singing, they were tossing coins, trying to get the coin into the megaphone and go down his throat. He was very intuitive. He always tried to keep his finger on the pulse. His mom fronted him the money to buy, which was a new contraption at the time, an amplifier and a microphone. And so he had this little PA system, which was becoming popular. So he got a lot of work with little quartets and trios around New Jersey.
My hair is curly, the man's got curly hair.
Frank said, well, Dad, I want to be in show business. I want to be a singer. His father said to him, but if that's what you intend to do, you're not going to do it on my dime. So pack your stuff and get out of here. He packed a bag and he went outside and was standing out on the street, and he's thinking to himself, where the hell am I going?
The clue to the entire career is the Major Bowes Amateur Hour broadcast.
We have now the Hoboken Four. They call themselves the Singing and Dancing Fools.
This is a program in which all of the contestants show their subservience to Major Bowes. They want to get on with their career. And Sinatra gives them a little gas.
Who speaks for the group?
I will. I'm Frank. We're looking for jobs. How about it? Everyone that's ever heard us liked us.
Sinatra is the upstart, even though he's not the solo artist. He's just still a member of the Hoboken Four. And yet what Sinatra became, he already was in the 30s. And how ironic that this format of the talent show would become a fixture through the years, most recently in American Idol, The X Factor. But the very first big winner was Frank Sinatra and the Hoboken Four.
Just because I'll always wear a smile. Must always wear a smile.
After the Hoboken Four won a talent contest, which was back in 1935, the prize they got was a tour of America, a 6-month radio tour. But when that finished, there was nothing, and Sinatra went right back to having to hustle for gigs, going from place to place each night, trying to persuade people he could come and sing for them. But his mother got him a job in a restaurant as a singing waiter. It was a tough time. I mean, he didn't really have instant success or anything like that. And during that time, also, he married his childhood sweetheart, Nancy Barbato.
She was there during his struggling years when he was just throwing himself against the wall trying to make something happen. And extremely, extremely supportive. She was a legal secretary. For a while, she was the breadwinner in the family, which to an Italian-American, especially from that era, does not sit well.
It's striking how much of a hustler he was and how clever he was at sometimes working for free in order to sort of advance his profile.
Frank's cousin, Ray Sinatra, was an integral part of the house orchestra at NBC. Ray helped Frank a lot. If they were doing a radio broadcast of some sort and the singer fell out, Frank, you're up. Harry James evidently heard one of these remote broadcasts, liked him. Frank loved the Harry James Band, and to him, the two top bands were Harry James and Tommy Dorsey. He was thrilled to meet Harry, and they struck a friendship almost immediately, and he started going out on the road with Harry.
He worked very, very hard to make his voice incredible. And he also had enough self-confidence and chutzpah to make his voice different. Even Tommy Dorsey realized what a hot property he was as a vocalist.
Tommy heard about the noise that this young upstart was making, and he approached Frank. And Harry, I think Harry already had an inkling. Harry said to him, listen, do well, and just make sure that he's able to pay you more than I was.
From watching the way that Dorsey played the trombone, That's how Sinatra learned to breathe.
He was studying the way Tommy was playing to try to figure out how he could do the same thing with his voice that Tommy was doing with the trombone.
Within my heart.
He knew that his popularity was gaining by leaps and bounds.
Here was this person who was #1 in 1940 for 12 weeks with Tommy Dorsey. I'll Never Smile Again.
Until I smile at you.
Tommy actually felt that he was being upstaged by, in his mind, an employee. People were coming specifically just to see Frank perform. That was beginning to rub Tommy the wrong way. Tommy was a very hot-headed, headstrong guy. He drank a lot. And Sinatra was a hothead, and that these guys were getting into fistfights, and Frank was hell-bent on making that departure. And he felt that the clock was ticking loudly. Tommy said, fine, you gonna leave the band? Then I'm drawing up an agreement. And Frank signed it, but the contract that he signed was a lot worse than just paying 33 1/3% to Tommy. I think it was as much as 20% to the lawyer who drew up the contract. Frank could not sustain financially under this immense amount of pressure. Something had to be done. Annie Sachs, Henry Jaffe, and Lou Wasserman went to Frank's agents and said to him, listen, Frank is leaving you and he's coming with us. They got him a recording contract with Columbia. The money that they took from Columbia, they paid to Tommy. Tommy was more than happy to take a cash buyout. Doing the conversion from then till now, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $750,000 in cash.
Sinatra left the Tommy Dorsey band and became the first rock star.
Here is one of the great transitions in music business history. You have the singer who is not a member of a band. He is a solo singer.
When he leaves Dorsey around 1942, the most popular singer in the world was Bing Crosby, and Bing Crosby sang with what was essentially a dance band plus 4 strings.
Get on, get on, get on the road to victory. Get off, get off, get off the rusty dusty, and get on, get on, get on the road to victory. Buy another bond today.
And then when Sinatra went out on his own, and very few people had heard him by that point, he always insisted on having like 12 strings. It always had to be much bigger, much more ambitious presentation, and that was the way Sinatra would distinguish himself from Bing Crosby, but also from Perry Como, from Dick Haymes, from all the other band singers.
My stardust melody, the memory of love's refrain. My stardust melody, the memory of love's refrain.
He was always a singer who you felt was reacting to what the orchestra were doing. So it was almost like he was having a conversation with the music.
When he sang, he had a way, he just had an elegance in his diction that never crossed over into prissiness or preciousness.
His voice is fantastically understated. He trades on a kind of wit and on a confidentiality, actually. Frank seems to be sometimes to be whispering to you.
But a dream, I hope I never waken.
The thing about Frank that was unique was that he was a visionary. I mean, he, in 1942, when he was a 26-year-old big band singer, he saw the whole path. He saw what popular music was, and he saw what he wanted to be. And he knew that there was more to popular music than anybody had ever imagined before.
World War
War II, pushing back an enemy who was awfully unhappy about giving up even a foot of ground. One lousy little foot.
The planets really aligned. It was the war, it was the absence of men, it was the girls having to work and therefore having money for the first time. The early female revolution and female sexual expression coalescing at that time and suddenly bursting out.
Every afternoon, as soon as school is out, you all go over to the music store and spend hours listening to them.
When Frank Sinatra sang All or Nothing at All, he knew what he was singing about, the Bobby Soxers knew what he was singing about, and he knew that the Bobby Soxers knew what he was singing about. It was the introduction of sex into popular music.
Frank was the first person to be connecting with the first ever generation of teenagers. He sort of started that whole idea of fan mania. You know, it wasn't the Beatles, actually, it was Frank.
He appealed to women, and he knew it. And from day one, he knew exactly what he wanted to do.
He was the first guy that really caused a frenzy with girls.
At New York's Paramount Theater, traffic-stopping crowds as Frank Sinatra opens a sensational 3-week engagement.
Try to imagine 35,000 screaming girls trying to get into one theater.
There was no other guy that would play the Paramount Theater in New York City and have Bobby Soxers tearing the place up trying to get to Frank Sinatra. Well, if that's not rock star, I don't know what is.
And to a certain extent, there were girls who went crazy over Bing Crosby. There were girls who went crazy over Benny Goodman. And Sinatra took it to a whole other level.
They would pin his photographs to their lapels, then they would start stitching his name into their clothing, and they would collect in groups. They all wanted to be the same. So they started wearing bobby socks, and the boys started wearing bow ties to try and copy him. And you've got this incredible burgeoning fashion industry.
Well, in warm weather we wear dresses instead of sweaters and skirts.
And here you see the seeds of what is now, we know, a multi-billion-dollar worldwide industry born in those girls queuing outside the theatre in New York in the 1940s. Girls in every other area of their lives who were not allowed to step out of line, suddenly finding themselves being given collective permission to completely let rip and literally rip their knickers off and wet themselves in a public arena and scream the loudest they'd ever screamed. And by the way, all that releases dopamine, which is the pleasure drug of the brain.
Teenage women who found themselves presented with this fantastic idol saw not only his kind of animal magnetism and immense charm and sex appeal, I think they saw an image of a man who had a kind of affluence and a prosperity that would look after them, that would support them, and that would show them the most fantastic time.
During World War II, your idea of a star was like John Wayne, who was silent and stoic, or Gary Cooper. These were kind of the male icons of the period. Tough, they never showed their emotion. If they cried, it was internally. They never let people see that. Whereas Sinatra was just the opposite. Sinatra comes along and shows you every emotion. When he's feeling romantic, you feel it. When he's feeling happy, you feel it. No matter what he's thinking, you feel it. Men just didn't show that kind of sensitivity. The major thing about Sinatra was this absolute emotional honesty. If he was feeling great, he let you know it. If he was feeling lousy, he let you know it. If he loved you, he let you know it. If he hated you and wanted you to drop dead, he was not good about keeping quiet about that either. It was just, like I say, total candor. And he put it into every song. I mean, it's there. It's there for us to hear now. And every lyric, every word, it's exactly, where he was right at the moment.
And I've got no defense for it. The heat is too intense for it. What good would common sense for it do? 'Cause it's
He sang without a mask. This kind of tough guy allowed himself, when he sang these songs, to be completely vulnerable.
gone with the wind, just like a leaf that has blown away.
He was utterly involved. He showed the way, really, for the different kind of show business that came along. I think he was allowed to be neurotic Bing Crosby was not allowed to be neurotic, or would not allow himself to lose his poise in order to be neurotic. Sinatra was able to do that, and he certainly pointed the way for the rock revolution, where people can just behave the way they feel that day.
It wasn't that Sinatra had a rock star swagger, but rock stars had a Sinatra swagger.
The great stars before Sinatra didn't let their darker side be seen publicly. Sinatra did. Rock and roll thinks it invented having a chip on your shoulder, but Sinatra was there first.
Everybody realized that Frank Sinatra did what he wanted to do.
He had an ego, which was why he waged war on so many journalists who gave him less than favourable reviews over the years.
We have a name in the States for their counterparts. They're called parasites, because they take and take and take and never give. Absolutely never give.
Obviously, he understood that it made him easier to empathise with, that people were privy to some of his indiscretions, as long as there was this sense of a sort of struggle being played out, and one that was reflected in his music. I think it transcends entertainment. You know, our favourite politicians are the ones who don't give that much of a damn about what you think.
He was in charge of his own ship all the time. I mean, he's the one that chose the songs. He really chose the arrangers.
The whole idea is that pop was ephemeral and there was constant turnover, and that the business was predicated on 10 big songs this week and another 10 big songs next week. And Sinatra was really the first to go back to even songs that were, say, 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 years old and say, I want to do this song. It's not one of the contemporary songs, but I think this is a great song.
There's songs in his catalog that he puts a stamp on that there's no way you can imagine it really being done any other way.
Sinatra recording, take 3.
Something like half the songs that Sinatra did at Columbia were older songs, which is something that nobody saw coming. Nobody had the faintest idea in the pop music business that a song could have a shelf life of more than a week and a half. It was a very, very radical and subtle thing that he did. By the mid-1940s, he was responsible for pretty much every note that he sang. The mere fact that he decided to do an album in 1945, something that nobody had ever done before, that was totally his decision.
You go to my head, and you linger like a haunting refrain.
There was no television back in the 40s. There was no internet. There was no YouTube. And the way your image expanded around the world was through movies. And Frank Sinatra very deliberately set out to become a movie star.
The melancholy which you can hear in his voice that made him so passionately adored by young women. That was theatre. He was a bloody good actor.
Surrounded by people, oh, how real it all starts to seem.
People are, to my amusement, always astonished when a pop star puts in a credible film turn.
Frank's first films were basically cameos when he was still the boy singer with the big bands.
I think of you day and night and day.
The turning point for Frank is in Anchors Away, when he's alone in the Hollywood Bowl and the camera comes in for a close-up of Frank Sinatra alone at a piano singing I Fall in Love Too Easily.
I fall in love too easily.
And it is that moment when I think it all changed for Frank Sinatra. He's a movie star.
Film honors for The Voice. Frank Sinatra gets some good news from MGM production chief Louis B. Mayer.
Frank, I'm proud to tell you that the readers of the Modern Screen magazine have selected you as the most popular film star of 1946. Thank you, Mr. Mayer.
And then it all fell apart for him.
There was a very dark period in my career, about 1951. Very frankly, and there's no secret about it, I could hardly get myself a job in those days.
And it fell apart for him because when he made a wisecrack about Louis B. Mayer, and it got back to Louis B. Mayer, who fired him, called him into the office and said, "You're done. I don't care. You're out of here." And of course, at the same time, his record sales were dropping because the Bobby Soxers were growing up.
Around the beginning of the 50s, Sinatra had a bit of a tough time. His popularity was dwindling slightly. Styles of music had changed and young people were listening to something different.
You ain't nothing but
One of the reasons Sinatra thought his career had gone into decline was because of a new head of A&R at CBS Records, Mitch Miller. Mitch Miller was actually a classical musician who thought pop music was trivial and rubbishy and made records which were trivial and rubbishy, and then had enormous success with them, which really amazed everybody. He did songs like How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, or She Wears Red Feathers in a Hula Hula Skirt. And Sinatra hated them and hated him.
He was having a rough time in the late 40s, early 50s. Frank was not selling records. Mitch Miller was telling him to, he had to sing more novelty songs that would be hits.
We know he wasn't happy with Mitch Miller at Columbia, giving him some cutesy songs to sing. I think the low point was when he had to do a duet with Dagmar.
Dagmar!
Mr. Sinatra,
Yes, ma'am.
why did you call me a spectacle?
Well, because you're so good for the eyes.
She said,
Mama will bark.
you look so lovely in the moonlight.
Yes, but Papa will bark.
Your eyes are shining like the starlight.
Yes, but Mama will bark.
Your lips are so inviting, darling, give me one more kiss.
I wanted to see what he was like again. I did. He'll never change.
Frank and Ava first met at MGM in the commissary. Ava was having lunch with Mickey Rooney, her new husband. He was the biggest star on the MGM lot.
What is this? Oh, I'm getting dizzy. Oh, maybe Cupid is after me.
And Frank passed by their table and he looked at Ava and he couldn't take his eyes off her and he said, honey, if I'd seen you first, I would have married you myself. They fell in love at first sight and it was explosive.
Frank actually told me a story one night. He said, we were down in Palm Springs at the house. He says, and we had had dinner and we started drinking and we were getting bored. He says, and the two of us went out in my Cadillac convertible, half loaded, both of us, driving around Palm Springs in the middle of the night, shooting out streetlights. That sounds like good fun to me.
He'd been a pretty big star in the late 40s. He'd peaked, I think, in 1946. By the time he met her in 1950, he was on the skids, he was on the way out, and she was on the way up. And he very much was riding her coattails.
There was a huge backlash with the general public. We're talking about the early 50s. For a married man with a couple of kids to be futzing around, Ava was a big star. She was like the Angelina Jolie of her day.
They conducted their affair very publicly, to the point in the end that Nancy's hands were tied. She had to really let him go.
As a matter of fact, candidly, Nancy Sr. told me he still came home at night to us. The only reason I actually granted him a divorce was because it was costing him too much professionally.
By the time they got married in November '51, the relationship was already over. They'd burned each other out.
Frank even said to me in later years, he said, anything that burned that hot was destined to burn out.
They had so much in common, which they didn't really realize. Had she been a man, she'd have been him. And had he been a woman, he'd have been her. And they didn't stand a chance. As Ava said, including injury time, they were only married for about 6 years. And then when she was in Africa in 1953, shooting Magambo, she was also pregnant at that time and suffering terrible morning sickness. And he'd heard about the casting of From Here to Eternity, based on James Stewart's novel, and he was determined to get the part of Maggio, the Italian, which he was very suited for. But the studio's written him off. Nobody was really interested in Frank Sinatra anymore. So he badgered everybody, including her, and she pulled strings, she called everyone she could think of, she did everything possible to get him the part.
Harry Cohn, at one time, was a song plugger, back when Frank was in the big band days. He went from being the song plugger and ended up being the head of Columbia. And basically, Harry Cohn was saying, listen, I'm not going to give you a screen test for a role like this. This is a strong, dramatic role. You're basically a song and dance man. Frank was still with Ava. She called Harry's wife and implored Harry's wife to talk to Harry on Frank's behalf.
Ava Gardner said, there's only one man that can play this role, and it's the son of a bitch I'm married to.
So he got the call, he flew to Hollywood, and the director said, listen, I want you to do a little improv. Show me that you're this street guy, Maggio. And the scene called for Frank to be slightly inebriated, sitting at the bar. And Frank reached into the condiment tray, and he picked 2 olives, and he shook them, and he rolled them down the bar as though they were dice.
7 for that, 5 deuce. 7. Snake eyes.
It's kind of the forerunner of Sinatra shaking imaginary dice, singing Luck Be a Lady.
Harry Cohn said, you know what, he is Maggio. I got to give him the role.
Sinatra said, I see Maggio every morning in the mirror when I shave.
You hit me. Yeah, and I'm about to do it again, too.
If Frank Sinatra had never made a record, he'd be remembered as a great film star, because he won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity.
The winner is Frank Sinatra.
And then when the movie took 8 Academy Awards and he won the Oscar for Best Actor in a Supporting Role, he got up to receive it. He thanked everybody he could think of, except Ava Gardner.
In 1 year in the United States, there are about 500,000 divorces. It's about 1 million men and women who look for lifelong happiness with each other admit that they had not found it.
They were divorced by 1957, but really the relationship was off by then. He was shagging around, she was too.
She backed up what in later years Frank told me about their relationship, that they were just far too much alike for that to ever have any kind of longevity. But they had a ball while they were together.
In 20 years, he's traveled from Hoboken to Hollywood, with stops in between. The voice, or as Jimmy Durante once called him, Moonlight Sinatra, has become one of Hollywood's great stars. Recently, after a comparatively inactive period, Variety credited him with the greatest comeback in theater history.
He completely reinvented his screen persona. Gone was the boy of the sailor suit musicals. And instead, on screen, really starting with From Here to Eternity, was a much darker persona. He was so ambitious that in 1955 alone, he made 5 major films. That would never, ever happen today. He couldn't stop. The engine inside him couldn't stop. What happened is he became so effective dramatically. He really was the only rival to Marlon Brando, who is the film actor of the 20th century. So you have Sinatra coveting Brando's role in On the Waterfront, and you have Brando coveting Sinatra's role in The Man with the Golden Arm.
I find myself picking whatever I do apart, which I do believe is quite healthy. And I found that after seeing The Man with the Golden Arm, I was as contented with that performance as I've been with anything I've ever done in my life.
How daring to do a film about a drug addict. This sounds like the ultimate downer. In the 1950s, when people didn't talk about drugs, they may have done them, but they didn't talk about them. So he was willing to go in territory where other actors and filmmakers were not.
Monkey is never dead, dealer. The monkey never dies. When you kick him off, he just hides in a corner waiting his turn.
That one took quite a bit out of him emotionally. He said that he went to a rehab facility and watched through a small portal a guy going through cold turkey. He was in a straitjacket, and the guy was banging his head against the wall, and he mimicked what he saw.
He said he felt he won the Oscar for the wrong film. You know, playing the drug addict in The Man with the Golden Arm certainly drew on even more of his capabilities.
Let me out! Ah!
It's very daring for someone to go there, and Frank Sinatra seemed to have no fear.
Feel in the mood for music? Let's go behind the scenes at this Hollywood recording studio to learn a little about how music is brought to us.
Capitol Records was founded by creative people as a kind of an answer to the other corporations. It was always slightly the underdog. It was small, independent, but had creatively interesting projects and would take chances on people that are in a second phase of their career.
In the early 50s, Sinatra got himself a new record deal, this time with Capitol Records. Actually, it was a rotten deal because he had to pay to make his own records. On the other hand, he thought, if I'm paying to make my own records, I'm going to make just the records I want to make. And what he had in mind was something quite revolutionary for a popular singer. He was only going to make albums, and each album would have a theme, just like a movie.
The concept album was actually a creation of Frank's back in his Capitol years. They would pick a subject, and all of the tunes were kind of fit that mode.
We have to remember how young the LP was when he became its master. The record album, as a 12-inch disc, was only invented in 1948.
The work of the factory begins with the arrival of the lacquer masters from the recording studios. It is from black discs like this one that eventually hundreds of thousands of copies will be born.
The record industry was mushrooming. The industry was getting more and more profitable, and Sinatra sort of went with that.
A lot of his career, he was right at the forefront of technology. You know, all of a sudden they had this album that could play more than one song at a time, and he had the idea to make it an experience.
There is this sort of orthodoxy of opinion that the concept album appeared fully formed with the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Frank Sinatra is here to tell us that that's not necessarily true.
Even though the LP was invented for classical music, it was Frank who made the first popular works that could only be on LP. The first themed albums. Those albums are classics, several of them in the Grammy Hall of Fame. The one that gets me the most to this day is Frank Sinatra Sings for Only the Lonely. People think record sales are associated with good times, but Frank knew people have many moods.
It's such a perfectly executed idea, this sense of singing to just a solitary person.
My poor heart ain't gaining any ground because my angel eyes ain't here.
Sinatra once told a reporter, I'm an 18-carat manic depressive. I live a life of violent contradictions. Consequently, I'm always hugely sad or over-elated. And the concept albums he made for Capitol reflect this. Some were immensely sad and morose, like Wee Small Hours or Songs for the Lonely, and others were pure elation, like Come Fly With Me.
Come fly with me, let's fly away. If you can use some exotic booze, there's a bar in far Bombay.
Come Fly With Me. It's not just about a list of beautiful places. You feel the guy's really got somebody he wants to take around the world with him.
He's this personification of the upside of America. Everybody felt we're going to make the world safe for democracy post-World War II. We as Americans were riding our high-finned Cadillac cars to the promised land of suburbia. And there's Frank supplying the soundtrack. He was making what I call the Technicolor albums.
Let us face, without panic, the reality of our times. The fact that atom bombs may someday be dropped on our cities.
At the same time, the flip side of it is he's making what I call the film noir albums, In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning, Only the Lonely. And it's reflecting what's going on in America, because the dark side of the promised land of suburbia is everybody's living with the knowledge that with the bomb, we can all be blown up instantaneously. The world can be destroyed. It's why it's still so compelling now, all that work from the 50s into the 60s. It's an artist at the height of his powers.
We don't see the end of the tunnel, but I must say I don't think it's darker than it was a year ago, in some ways lighter.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War.
But there are other reasons not to smoke marijuana.
But every casualty on both sides was a casualty caused by our policy.
Stealth has been used extensively in launching spacecraft for NASA. There have been 39 launches since 1960.
I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
Everything had changed. America was sort of the melding pot for everybody, but everybody had to pay their dues. Everybody had to kind of pay their dues to, you know, to meld in.
Early on, when it wasn't even fashionable to, he was fighting for civil rights. When he was on the bus with the big bands in the 40s and they wouldn't allow the black members of the band to stay at the hotel, he would fight for them.
He didn't see color, he didn't see ethnicity. His first closest association with a black performer especially, to my knowledge, was with Sam. And that came about right after he left Dorsey. Frank had a hand in helping him get on the map throughout his career. Once Frank put his arm around somebody and said, hey, this guy is it, then people would follow.
He did a lot of things that would have been dangerous to your career. Getting Sammy Davis Jr. at the time he did was really rebellious. Here you had a black singer that was with a white girl. So, I mean, right there, that's a major thing to do.
Well, as somebody said, Frank and the Rat Pack in Vegas were the Mount Rushmore of men having fun.
What the world knows to be the Rat Pack was originally Dean and Sammy, with the inclusion of Joey Bishop, Peter Lawford. There were other people, but the nucleus really was the trio.
They were the coolest guys in the world, him and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis.
The Rat Pack were his small, exclusive tribe.
Everybody wanted to be in on the party, and you just wanted to be a part of it. You wanted access to that glamour and that power.
There was a part of these guys that just never grew up. bunch of middle-aged adolescents, and it was part of their charm. They were having a great time, and they were just letting the audience in on it.
Mr. Lyndon B. Johnson, Mr. President.
You dirty rat. You get off there. You hit Lady Bird when
Sinatra often said, whatever gets you through the night. He liked to stay up all night. He preferred that than going to bed. And whatever got him through the night was most often not women. It was usually alcohol. He had a passion for Jack Daniel's bourbon whiskey.
Finally, somewhere around 8 o'clock the next morning,
Post time.
We're still sitting there drinking, the two of us. I said to Frank, you know, even for you, it's a pretty respectable hour to go to bed. This time he was stumbling a little bit, and I figured, you know what? I think I better help him get into bed, make sure he doesn't fall and hurt himself. So he gets undressed, and at some point he was completely naked, and he's sitting on the side of the bed, and I'm kneeling on the floor, and I had rolled his pajama pants up so that I'm sticking his foot through. All of a sudden I hear him say, "Maron, if you could only tell my buddy where you've been." And I look up at him, and he was talking to his Johnson. There was a story about George Burns. The guys were playing cards. They're getting a little bit drunk, and they decide to have a contest. Who actually has the biggest dick? George Burns is walking past the table, and he says, "Frank, please, go easy on the guys. Just take out enough to win." True story. Most of the clubs, no matter where you were owned by mob guys.
In that era, and for many years after that, the mob owned most of the nightclubs. They were all powerful. They were fun. They weren't a little threatening to him. And I guess he also liked the fact that he could have some power.
And he had his ties with the bad boys, and but that was the Italian thing, you know. I mean, I think Frank was so much a patron saint of the Italian that he was in it. You know, I mean, he pretty much had to be.
Young Frank Sinatra grew up in a tough Italian neighborhood. His dad had been a boxer, his mother dabbled in local politics. Sometimes they were going to meet gangsters, that's for sure. Probably Sinatra went to school with children of gangsters. For certain his mother and father would have said, don't mess with them, make friends with them. Don't get too friendly, but don't fall out either. Sinatra learnt the lesson well.
Sometimes you're asked to take a photograph with someone, sometimes you can't say no. Just because Frank was so popular and his name ended in a vowel, Frank used to joke that FBI stands for, it's an acronym that means Forever Bothering Italians.
Did you ever discuss with Mr. Giancana the fact that you might be a front for him at the Cal Neva, or that he might have some type of a hidden interest there?
No, never.
Okay. That FBI constantly tried to link Frank to the wise guys, that he was part of the mob, that he was created by the mob. Frank was fond of saying, I worked in most of the joints that were owned by wise guys. Consequently, there were times when I would associate and hang out with wise guys. They were my boss. If cardinals or monsignors had owned nightclubs, then I would have been hanging out with cardinals and monsignors. And they wanted to be around them. They emulated him as opposed to him emulating them. That's who ran the industry. That's who ran the nightclub industry.
The mob connections intersects with Sinatra's life throughout his career. When Tina Sinatra wrote her book, and she actually said to her father, how could you associate with somebody like Sam Giancana? She flat out asked him. And he said, I was not unaware of who and what he was, but he was always polite to me. And besides, Tina, it's not like I invited him to your first communion.
He was the bad guy with the mafia connections, but when he sang, nobody cared.
Rock and roll is a river of music. Rock and roll music is an art form. Rock and roll is here to stay.
I bought a brand new airmobile, it's custom made for the flight division.
All of a sudden, he was involved in the Beatles world. Everything had changed. At first, he was kind of very hesitant to to enjoy that kind of music.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog. You ain't nothing but a hound dog.
When Elvis Presley got his first hit, Sinatra hated it. He hated this new style of music. And he was incredibly rude to the press about Elvis. He said, "This rancid-smelling aphrodisiac I deplore." Elvis was amazingly polite in return. He said, "I admire the man. He has a right to say anything he wants."
He disrespected Elvis Presley publicly, and yet, when Elvis got out of the army, he made it his TV show on which Elvis returned to public consumption. It just says, okay, you're today's huge star, but guess what? I'm the all-time huge star.
Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go. You have made my life complete, and I love you so. Those fingers in my hair, I come hither stare.
Things were changing in the 1960s, but the fascinating thing is that Sinatra had more hits and sold more records than he had in any other previous time.
He was canny enough to know that when rock and roll came in, that he still had to stay on top of this field that he hated. He was still going to be the king. Then, of course, started his own record company. We know that. The first great label started by a recording artist, Reprise, but it had a variety of music on it as well as the type that he loved.
Reprise was very successful because it also had the license for Pi Records here in Britain, so Reprise put the Kinks out, one of the biggest UK band in America. Obviously put out Nancy Sinatra's records, Boots Made for Walking, obviously one of the biggest hits in the world in 1966.
These boots are made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. One of these days these boots are gonna walk all over you.
When I joined EMI Records, my first job in the music business was as a management trainee in Manchester Square, EMI. And it was 1966. Actually, it was the 6th of the 6th, 66. And EMI were doing very well because they'd got the Beatles. They were the biggest company in the world at that point, and they had many, many groups. But that week I joined, number one was Frank Sinatra, Strangers in the Night. He was able to move with the times. By the 60s, there was less hatred of something that wasn't quite in. People were not so divisive about popular music as they are now.
Strangers in the Night was a number one. Nobody who was young thought, this doesn't deserve to be here. It just seemed like part of the mix of music that we had in the 1960s, where everything coexisted. Nothing was out of bounds on the radio, and Sinatra just had this incredible period of about 3 years where he had several major hits.
He'd made several records with a new feel, a new style, and perhaps in keeping with that too, he went looking for a new style wife.
Mia Farrow, more haunted than in Rosemary's Baby, in another extraordinary performance.
Albert? Albert? I don't want to hear that name again! Are you still jealous?
Mia Farrow was a minor TV star, Alison Mackenzie in Peyton Place. I think in 1965 was the biggest thing on TV. She was on the lot where Frank was shooting Von Ryan's Express. And the minute she saw Frank Sinatra, she melted. She was gonna have this guy. She's a cunning minx, this girl. She went to the wardrobe department and she borrowed a transparent gown. And she would watch Frank as the cameras were rolling, and she was there every day. And one Friday he came off set and he said, hey kid, we're just going to pick up my plane and fly to the desert for the weekend and see you next week. And she said, take me. And he said, well, the plane only seats 3. So she said, send it back. And he was smitten, and the first thing he did was call up Ava and said that he'd taken up with Mia Farrow, and she said, well, I always knew you'd end up in bed with a boy. And as if Mia had heard that comment, she went right the next week and cut off her hair.
I mean, she was as young or younger than his own children.
Have you ever kissed anybody on this panel? yet? Oh, good.
Mr. Sinatra? You got the same name as mine.
Jackie Mason was appearing in Las Vegas at the same time as Sinatra. He talked about Frank Sinatra's marriage to Mia Farrow, that Mia Farrow had very short hair, skinny, waif-like looks. The implication was that she was a little boy and there was some kind of strange attraction there. Word of that got back to Sinatra. Not long afterwards, Jackie Mason was lying in bed and 3 shots were fired through the window, narrowly missing him.
What he wanted from her was for her to dump her career. She wanted a big movie career. He wanted a housewife.
As their relationship progressed, they just grew further and further apart. Her taste in music, the things that she was wont to do, go to India and hang out with gurus, as the Beatles were doing during that period of time, that was so far afield from who Frank was.
Frank served divorce papers on Mia without even telling her. She had no idea this was coming. This socked her in the face. She didn't know anything was wrong. She was in love, and he clearly wasn't.
By the end of the 60s, Sinatra had had 3 failed marriages.
And lady, don't think he doesn't know it. This guy really takes advantage of being a bachelor.
Tiger.
He's the gentleman that prefers blonde.
Tiger.
And brunettes. And redheads.
Frank Sinatra kept on good terms with most of his lovers. People made him allowances that they would not have made allowances for had he been less charming, or had he at least not seemed so upset or preoccupied or troubled by his own faults.
In me you see a man alone, held by the habit of being on his own.
The Man Alone album is of interest because he's interpreting this kind of elegant, lonely bachelor life certain men would have had in America in the late 60s. But he's embellishing it with his own sense of loneliness.
Always alone, at home or in a crowd, a single man, off on his private cloud.
He initially met Barbara in the mid-60s when Barbara was working at the Riviera Hotel as a showgirl. He met her again in the early 70s. She was married to Zeppo Marx, the youngest of the Marx brothers. He and Zeppo occasionally would play cards together, and he got acquainted with Barbara that way. And actually asked Zeppo, listen, I'm a single guy, I still have a lot of parties at my house. Would you mind if I borrowed Barbara to be the hostess from time to time? Which ultimately turned romantic, and Zeppo was an older guy and took ill, and they clicked.
She just was that simple thing which I think most men really want. She wasn't a challenge. He was free to be Frank Sinatra with her and be whoever he wanted.
Well, what do you think? This is it. The Touch-O-Matic 12.
Piacere di presentarvi Frank Sinatra, che questa sera vi canterà Come Fly With Me.
What you're going to hear about today is nothing short of a miracle.
The product of 4½ years of research.
Watertown was infamous for being the only album in which he sang to track. He always sang to live musicians. And Watertown was expected to be a success. It was written by Jake Holmes, whose credits bizarrely include his own hit So Close and a Led Zeppelin song. They took it from him and eventually had to credit it. But he wrote this album for Frank Sinatra. A television special was envisioned, and the record bombed because it just didn't sound like Sinatra. It wasn't warm. He wasn't interacting with the music as it was happening. He was a living, real-time artist.
Old water town, so much excitement to be found.
I think it's very telling that after the Watertown album, he wanted to retire. I mean, that was he at the end of the 60s, there was so much culturally that he just didn't understand.
There's an amazing piece of footage, which I think is quite easy to find, where he sings a song with the Fifth Dimension, where he has this kind of frilly Nehru collar. And it's one of the most uncomfortable things you've ever seen. But actually, if you look away, musically, I think it's great musically. It's just a horrible thing to look at.
Oh, sweet lioness, a little magic, a little kindness. Oh, sweet lioness, all over me.
All leaves on a pole.
I think whenever he kind of felt the need to blend into whatever was happening at the time, I mean, it happened a little bit in the 70s and the late 60s when he was trying to connect with what was happening in music. Those were the only times that it kind of wavered, and I don't think he ever felt comfortable with it anyway. He felt like I think, needed to retire because he didn't quite know what to do anymore.
Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention.
I interviewed Claude Francois a month before he died, and I asked him what he thought of My Way, which was the English language version of his French language hit, Comme d'habitude. And he said he preferred the original because it was about the end of an affair. Of course, what was given to Frank by Paul Anka was a lyric about the end of a career.
Most people think when they hear My Way, oh yeah, Paul Anka wrote that. The fact is, Paul did not write My Way. He co-wrote the lyric. Paul had the lyric translated from French into English, and all of a sudden he was drawing parallels to Frank, and he wrote down a lyric that he thought would work.
I'm very ambivalent about My Way. I mean, Sinatra's performance is superb. One or two of the lyrics still annoy me a bit. I mean, exemption, it's the wrong word. And other people doing it, it's usually pretty ghastly. But it's a great melody, and, you know, I've no wish to criticize Paul Anka, who's a great songwriter, but I think it works in the hands of a master.
Sinatra had just retired his own self-imposed exit, as he called it, his fallow period, where he was trying to just get some rest and spend more time with his friends and family and figure out what it was he wanted to do with the rest of his life. I first met Frank, I was a young performer. I was playing jazz guitar. I was all of 20 years old. I had developed a friendship with Jilly Rizzo.
Would you state your name, first of all?
Jilly Rizzo.
And your profession or occupation?
Entertainment and road manager.
How long, Mr. Rizzo, have you been associated with Frank Sinatra?
About 22 years.
Ironically enough, as a result of listening to a record that Frank made in '65, Live at the Sands, which to me, to this day, is still one of the best live recordings ever. And he kept talking about this place, Jilly's.
Good evening, salud. Chin down. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Jilly's West.
I was bouncing around New York playing a lot of clubs. And I said, I got to investigate this joint. And so I went in and befriended Jilly. We hit it off. He heard me play, put me in the rotation at the club. And it was a good 6 months or so before he actually introduced me to Frank. They come walking in, and Frank was fighting his way through the crowd to come to his booth in the back of the room. And then Jilly comes over to me and he said, so listen, you have your axe in the car? And I said, yeah. He said, good. He said, why don't you go get it? He said, because the old man wants to hang out, and I'm going to close the joint early tonight, and I want him to hear you play. And Joe Patrone on piano, Lou Berryman on bass, and me on guitar. And we were there till about 7:30 in the morning. About 4 tunes into this, Patrone says to me, you know, Tone, why don't you do something alone on guitar? You talk about flop sweat. Here I am, right across the piano from Frank. He had moved up from the booth to the piano bar and was sitting right across the piano from me. It dawned on me what would probably be a good tune to play. Frank had recorded an album with Joe Beam, and I knew he had a pretty soft spot in his heart for that stuff. So I started to play the tune, How Insensitive.
How insensitive I must have seemed when she told me that she loved me.
And as I'm playing chords and melody together, Frank starts humming, which almost caused me to drop the guitar. And little by little, it went from him humming to him now singing the tune. He's sitting there with his eyes closed, and now I'm accompanying him. And at the end of the tune, he did a tag. I followed him, and then he held the note, and I played it out, and we ended together as though we had rehearsed it. Frank opened his eyes, and he looked across the piano at me, and he said, nice job, kid. We clicked. And Jilly made certain that whenever Frank was coming into the city, whether I was in rotation to work at the club or not, he made sure that I had an audience with Frank and was always seated in Frank's booth with Frank, and I was allowed to bring pals of mine. And I found out in later years, as I discussed things with Frank in the 90s, 20 years later, Frank told me part of the reason that I took that brief respite from the business was that I wasn't sure in my heart of hearts that what I was doing in the industry still had relevance to your generation. And your enthusiasm and your friends' enthusiasm to meeting me and being in my company was partially what gave me it was part of the catalyst which convinced me that I should indeed come out of retirement, that I still did matter.
There aren't many artists where you think, hey, we haven't heard from him in half a year. Time for another hit. No, most people just slip off into oldies land. But you always wanted to hear what Frank Sinatra could do in the new era.
It's very unusual for somebody to add to his signature songs late in his career. I mean, My Way was quite late in his career. And then New York, New York was extremely late in his career.
I found it tremendously moving that this great hit, which was his last, would have been one of the very first thoughts that he'd ever had in his career when he was in Hoboken, looking across the Hudson River at the lights of New York. If I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere. And that's exactly what happened. It's so appropriate.
If I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere. It's up to you, New York, New York.
Those later records, I think, with the crack in the voice and the sort of this ongoing attempt to reconcile his own myth to the encroaching frailties of old age, can be terribly moving.
The Duets album, the concept actually really was something that Frank came up with himself.
I had paid Frank, by the way, $1.5 million to sign him at 78 years old.
He's got great people. He's got like Anita Baker, he's got Bono, he's got Julio Iglesias. That works for me.
We arranged for Frank to go into the Capitol Studios in Los Angeles. And the first night of the sessions, we had about, 50 musicians ready to record, and Frank walked in. He got to the mic, he looked around, and he walked out.
It almost got derailed when they were explaining to Frank that the other artist would more than likely not be in the studio with him which was kind of unsettling to him because he liked the spontaneity of everyone doing something right now all together.
I think he got a little freaked out. I think the first night they had him in a booth. He had always been comfortable singing in the middle of the room with a mic. The second night, that's how they had it set up. He came in, and as the professional that he was, he actually sang 9 songs.
We walked in there at just around 8 o'clock, and by about 9:15, he had recorded 9 songs. It's the way he worked when he was on. Some of them were first take.
Sinatra owns the album. The other people are just backing singers. It's all about him.
This was not a world waiting to hear Frank Sinatra. Quite the opposite. It was a world listening to New Kids on the Block and, Wilson Phillips and Vanilla Ice.
The week the album came out, Frank Sinatra, at age 77 and a half, 8 almost, knocked Pearl Jam out of position #1 on Billboard.
Shortly after we released the CD, it was a big charity event, and Barbara Sinatra was in charge of this particular charity. And I brought with me a check for $1 million. I gave him this $1 million check, and I said, this is just the beginning of many more. He looked at the check, and he said to Barbara, he said, "Dear, it's for your charity."
Here's a guy who had had major success in the recording industry in 7 different decades. 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and now the 90s.
The old man, I guess he'll think I can lick every other fella's father. Well, I can.
We certainly don't mind as audiences if people we love, show their frailties, as long as they're not showing them every 10 seconds or so. As long as there is a show to give, then especially if you have a shared history with someone, it really is enough to be in the same room as them.
You look at the audience in the later shows, and they're still spellbound. They're still feeling the magic. And he's still able to unlock that intense feeling, but it's just not screaming anymore. It's much more internal. And right at the end of his career, this extraordinary scene where he falters and stops and someone shouts, "We love you," and then the whole crowd starts shouting. And they're giving it back to him, so you've got this wonderful circle.
The only time I saw Frank Sinatra live was in 1994, and I was 17 years old. I remember just being so thrilled to be in his presence, and at that point in his career, he was kind of, forgetting lyrics a lot and things like that. But there were moments, several of them that night, where he would just get a hold of it.
She'd never bother baby with some bum she would hate. That's why this chick, she's a champ.
I read a review of that show where the reviewer said it was kind of like a very skilled veteran pilot trying to land a 747 with one engine out.
That's why the lady, that is why the lady, that's why this chick is a champ.
People just loved him so much. It's like a relative that you take care of when they get old. As an audience member, it's like he'd given so much over the years. I just felt it at the time too, that everybody just understood.
Empathy and compassion are very, very stirring states of being. Nowhere more than with somebody who has been a world champion, the top of their game, someone like Sinatra. Imagine the emotion swirling through the audience where he's starting to falter. It's like the 103-year-old man running the marathon. The whole crowd is cheering every footstep as they pick themselves up, having fallen, and make it across the line.
Or die.
Francis Albert Sinatra.
That's the best welcome I ever had.
At this hospital in California, at 10 minutes to 11 last night, the legend passed into history. There was none bigger, sometimes none meaner, and this morning his mortality has shocked his fans.
It was not expected. I had lunch with him that afternoon, poolside at his house in Beverly Hills. I said, I'm gonna be back, I'll be back tomorrow. I said, you and I are gonna spend the weekend together because Barbara is having a gathering of her girlfriends. And I left. For some reason, I felt the need to check in on him, and I called Vine. She was way more than a maid and a housekeeper. She was like a gal Friday, and he was very, very flushed, and he was having difficulty breathing. And I told him he's got to get to the hospital now. And when I arrived, he was already in a triage unit, and they were working on him feverishly. And he passed.
I do not regret it. I never will regret it because I am an entertainer.
Frank loved to tell a story about doing a show with Luciano Pavarotti. He was into Pavarotti's dressing room. He says, listen, Maestro, I have a question for you. Yeah, sure. He says, I'm having difficulty closing out a phrase in the sense of a diminuendo, just closing out a phrase and bringing the note to a knife's edge and then letting it go. Do you have any advice for me? And Pavarotti looked at me and said, Frank, that's a simple. You just to close up of your mouth. Frank says, I'll never ask him another goddamn question.
The popularity of Frank Sinatra was so great, but the stigma against Italian Americans stopped.
I grew up in upstate New York in this little town, and in an Italian household, there'd be a picture of the Pope, and there'd be a picture of Frank Sinatra.
Everything he did was just super sophisticated without being elitist.
I think he believed every single word of every song.
When we picked up the casket for the first time, it was a solid bronze casket. It was very heavy. And Don Rickles would not let go how heavy this casket was. And I said, Don, it's a sensitive subject. He said, why? When Frank passed away, we actually owed one of the wise guys a favor. The reason the casket was so heavy is there were two other guys in the casket with Frank underneath. Went, oh, Jesus Christ. To this day, he doesn't know whether I was joking or not.
Bobby Darin, Connie Francis, Dion, for heaven's sakes, Frankie Valli, and all of these people occupy the middle ground between the ballad from Italian art song and rock and roll. It's the great transition. And so Sinatra is an indispensable part of the music of the 20th century, not only for his own body of work, but for where we were going to.
Obviously, Frank Sinatra was bigger than life for so many years.
Sinatra was that icon that you can never, ever get bigger than.
You felt like you understood his story, and if he were in the same room as you, he would certainly understand your story as well.
Of trying, I'm tired of living, but I'm feeling